Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. So once again, we're praying for his kingdom to come and his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's Eden talk, folks. Jesus put Eden right in the middle of the great disciples' prayer. Now, children up through age 6 can be dismissed to go with Pastor Christy and her team. And Kelly's discipleship class is not meeting this morning because most of Kelly is over at Lake Placid helping over there, Pastor Kelly and so many others. So if any of you here would normally be part of that discipleship class, you would be remaining in here with us this morning. So we're in this series, the Eden Motif. We're looking at how Eden is a reoccurring theme constantly in the Bible and in God's salvation plan. And so this morning we're going to be talking about something which I believe is extremely important for us to get a handle on, but will be difficult for some people. In fact, I'm going to say some things this morning that many of you are going to think are almost comic book science fiction stuff, but I promise you, I'm going to give you about 1/10 of what I've actually researched. And I could literally spend, and I will not, I proved that in the first service, hours giving you more and more data and more research. And much of this stuff that will seem so far-fetched to you is actually being taken seriously by a major part of the so-called intelligentsia of our world and of our culture, and even here in America. So I want to talk to you this morning from the theme of pursuing Pseudo-Eden. Pursuing Pseudo-Eden. And the word pseudo is a word which means false. If something is pseudo, it's false. It's not the real thing. And we're going to be talking about Pseudo-Eden. In 2009, Ray Kurzweil, who is well known, among others, helped to establish Singularity University. Physically based in Ames Research Center in California at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, it was funded by industry leaders such as Google and others. Billions have been donated to its pursuits. But the question immediately, how many of you have ever heard of Singularity University? Okay, a few of you. All right. There is many things they promote, some of them good, but I want to share with you some things that are believed by especially its founder and many of the people along with him, and what they are promoting in this world today. So we can ask the question, what is Singularity University? And I want to use this as an example to help us understand what's going on in the world today. The first thing that you would discover that many, especially the founder and many of the others who promote this university they believe in this. They believe in something called the Omega Point. And you may never have heard of the Omega Point. But this is defined as the point where everything in the universe spirals toward a final unification. They're big about the fact that they believe there is an evolutionary process that is bringing everything to unification. Now, this term was invented by the French Jesuit Catholic priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who tried to mix Christianity along with various spiritualistic ideas that we would now today call primarily New Age ideas. But this Omega Point is to be a kind of unification of all things. Now, this brings into view where the university got its name, and that is what they promote, what they call the singularity. Now, this is defined as something that the Omega Point is seen as the final step before what is called the singularity takes place. Once we achieve, or as they say, cross into singularity, which will be the first and truly major evolutionary step for mankind, and that's according to these pseudoscientific pronouncements, we will cease to be humans. Now that sounds weird, but follow me on this because this is what they teach and this is what their books are full of. We will cease to be human. Why? This leads to something which some call transhumanism, or the post-human, or the superhuman demagogue. This omega point and singularity are to create the post-human, the superhuman, that has conquered, transcended nature and escaped into what they call the noosphere. Now, we'll talk about the noosphere more in a moment. But this whole idea is that we're going to create something superior to present humanity. And we're going to see how they expect that to happen in just a moment. But this, and let me just pause here and say to you, this transhumanism is as old as Genesis. It was the scheme of the fallen Elohim, the fallen spiritual spirits, who descended to Mount Hermon in Genesis 6, 1-4, and attempted to breed a transhuman species that ended up being the Elohim, not the Elohim, but the Nephilim. And they attempted to do this to create a hybrid humanity that could exterminate true humanity, so the seed which had been promised through the woman could not come and destroy their power. This resulted in such bloodshed and such chaos and mayhem on the earth that God ultimately had to literally destroy the whole earth, except for one human family that was genetically pure, and that was Noah's family, so that the seed could indeed come to the earth as God had promised. And so we see that this idea of making a hybrid human, a transhuman, is not a new idea. And the spawn before the flood is something that God condemned and had to be obliterated. Now, this all leads to something that is called the noosphere. Now, in the way it's spelled, some of you may think that looks like noosphere, but it's not. It's pronounced noosphere. Now, what is this noosphere? Well, in the theories of a Russian scientist, Verdansky, the noosphere is the third in a succession of phases of development on planet Earth. Now, what they talk about is that, first of all, in the universe comes what is called the geosphere. This is when we get material things, and we get planets, and we get suns, moon, stars, and all this thing. This is the material universe as we know it. Then came what they call the biosphere, and you would recognize that as referring to bios, meaning life. And somehow this biosphere produced biological life. And of course, you would recognize this as all being rooted in the theory of evolution, but we're going to see it's not the strict scientific theory of evolution. It's a mythological version of that, which believes in progressivism, that everything is always being pushed upward, which goes contrary to real science. Now, in the process of emerging, we are now in the process of emerging, according to these people, the noosphere, which is being created by the ascent of human cognition and intelligence. Human intelligence is viewed as in its infancy and has yet to fully emerge as the mastering force over the universe that it has the potential to achieve. This noosphere will fundamentally and radically transform what we now call the biosphere of life. This fundamental transformation, according to them, is to take place by means of a new kind of emergent evolution. This is not the strict theory of evolution as we sometimes see it in the hard sciences, but rather this is a kind of mythological evolution of progressivism where everything is always moving upward and onward, and everything is always getting better and better and better. They believe that the pathway to achieving this emerging evolution must lead to this: human-directed evolution. They believe that evolution, as defined by them, has come to the place that this emergent evolution is now in the process in which has brought humans to the place where we can now cooperate in our own evolution and direct it to our own desired ends. In other words, in their view, we have been given intelligence somehow, miraculously. Some believe there's actually an impersonal force driving this developmentalism, this upward force that goes contrary to the second law of thermodynamics and everything else we see in the universe, and that somehow we are evolving to be something better than we are and constantly better. And they also believe that, and some believe that this has happened maybe by accident, but others believe there is an impersonal force driving it. They never make it personal because they don't want God to be in the picture. But they believe that because we now have intelligence, through technology and science, we can now participate in our own evolution and direct it to a desired end. And that predetermined desired end is that we should create the superhuman. We should create the posthuman. We should create the transhuman who has transcended the limits of mere naturalistic existence and completely moved to a new plane of consciousness and existence. The idea of human-directed evolution, they range from radical alteration in human DNA for the purpose of creating a super race to major integration of humans with computers and machines along with DNA alteration in order to create immortality and godlike powers. Many openly proclaim that they believe we will overcome death by technology, that we will be able to make man live forever. I'm sorry, but I wouldn't want to live forever in this condition and in this world. But I'm looking forward to the one I am going to live forever in. But we need to be aware that all of this is based on something which Lewis and many other scientists are now openly calling scientism. And that is not the same as hard science. It is a kind of scientific mythology that has attached itself to evolutionary theory and turned it into a myth that everything is being driven upward by some mysterious force. And one way to define this scientism is this way: science irrationally combined with our evolutionary mythology. It's called evolutionism, which states that everything must inevitably keep progressing in the upward direction. Now, this is not tied in any way to scientific data because there isn't any that proves that that is going on or happening. And it is interesting that this is a growing ideology in the midst of the fact that the hard scientists are now, especially in the microbiology areas, are now writing books, even non-Christians are writing books, talking about the demise of evolution, the demise of Darwinian evolution, because there's no evidence for it. In fact, we're learning that there's so much design in the cell, so much design in the universe. Everything is so designed that even atheists are writing books calling for the demise of evolution and saying it's had its day, it's a 150-year-old theory that is proven to be false. Now, does that mean they're becoming Christians? No, many of them are not. A few. Many of them are going to any other kind of theory that keeps God out of the picture. Spanpermia, and so on. But of course, all that does is if you think aliens put us here, it's just put the question a little further back. Who created the aliens, okay? So, in other words, you don't really solve the problem. But this is one of the things that is going on. We are moving from hard science to scientism, and unfortunately, many hard scientists who have real credentials in certain fields are being pulled into this as a worldview, even though their science doesn't actually support it. So they redefine this evolutionism as an irresistible upward force. And this evolution believes that humans are the result of this fortunate undirected process or a directed process by this impersonal force. They conclude that humans are destined to take control of their evolution and guide it so it can transcend humanity and become what some refer to as the transhuman, the transcendent human. They believe that religion and traditional and state cooperation is needed to produce a willing world. And they believe that this is absolutely necessary because they believe that this should be a worldwide movement. This is to be a global initiative if it is to work, and they wish to remove all resistance. Those in the transhumanist movement see the power of science to do something as primarily its right to do it. Now, we have some hard scientists, some good scientists, and some very, what I would say, level-headed scientists who are actually ringing the alarm bells about this, because they're saying just because we have the power to do something doesn't mean that we should do it, because some of it's immoral, unethical, and some of it is frighteningly dangerous because there are always unintended consequences. And they close their eyes to this out of their ideology. And so we have good scientists trying to rebuke this, but we have a huge percentage of scientists joining this movement. And so what they want is they want this movement to be able to go forward with no external ethical or moral restraints by traditional, religious, or any form of objective morality. This is due to various forms of belief that conclude that they are obeying, as enlightened scientific humans, an impersonal force to which there is inevitability. In other words, there's an inevitability to this evolutionary upward process, and they must serve that inevitability because it's going to happen anyway, so it's important that we guide it to the conclusion that we want. And they seek and therefore believe they have the right to use the power of governments to forward this process because it is their supreme duty, and therefore abrogates or cancels all ordinary moral laws. Now that should be frightening to you to hear that term, and I'm actually kind of loosely quoting one of their books. They believe that this ideal is so important that it abrogates or cancels them being controlled by any moral law. In other words, this sounds a lot like Hitler's rationalizations for killing the Jews. It was good for society to get rid of the Jews. He was creating a master race. Therefore, it was okay for him to do these atrocities, and because he had an overriding concern to create the perfect utopian society, the Third Reich. Stalin and communism had some of these same ideas, and they sacrificed people for the common good. This is something that is very, very dangerous. They also see the need of a religious perspective, a spiritual evolutionism rooted in the idea that everything is moving upward and onward in a good way that should be promoted among the masses as a powerful motivating force. This needs to be marketed to the public first subliminally, and they will do it, and they have been doing it for decades in entertainment, media, education. And although you may laugh at and say, oh, it's just silly entertainment, but you may be shocked that how many of our sci-fi movies now are about enhanced humans and superhumans and humans who have developed special powers and so on. Believe it or not, even though we laugh at that and say that's really just entertainment and silly, it is. But the point is that many believe that some of these things will be possible through technology and through humans leaping into what they call the noosphere, because they believe it's going to be a very spiritual thing. And they've been declaring in the last few years that they believe they are at the point of becoming increasingly open about this, and that it's time for the world to buy in and to get on board. The illusion at the heart of this belief, of course, is the pervasive developmentalist philosophy that evolution is a fact, even though we've seen that the hard sciences are saying no. Professor Julian Savalinsky, who is head of the Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics at Oxford University, and notice the term practical ethics, is a leading proponent of human enhancement, and he's a professor at Oxford University. He is part of the school of thought that promotes the progressive use of biotechnology to improve human intelligence, moral reasoning, and other traits such as physical strength. Now, don't get me wrong. There are good things that come out of some of these studies. They build interfaces for handicapped people and prostheses and these kinds of things, and that's good. But don't think for a moment that this is the only thing that is going on. Most of the money is going to transhumanist efforts, and there are literally billions being spent in that area. This professor literally promotes what he calls a mass mutation in the monoamine oxidate A in order to make mankind less aggressive and more compliant. In other words, it's a DNA alteration to mass humanity. This arrogant scheme in which these proponents close their eyes to the unintended consequences is truly Frankenstein frightening. And notice that this term practical ethics in the title of the Oxford University think tank means that objective moral ethics that mankind has had in its conscience for millennia is now considered invalid because it gets in the way of this transhumanism. Therefore, we need to come up with a practical ethic that is generated by a social construct and based upon something that is not objective but relative. And what this will simply do is take one aspect of objective morality, because we can't produce a new morality. We can put a second sun in the sky. But they will take one aspect of morality, pull it out of its place, swell it to madness, and turn it into an immorality that tries to replace morality and will masquerade as morality. But the truth is, it usually is done to justify some ideological system. These would be programmers who plan to cut out the rest of future humanity according to their own vision. And by the way, if you think about it, these people consider themselves so qualified to do this that they can determine what the rest of humanity should look like according to their view for millions of years forward. In other words, they are the few who will control the destiny of millions by making them what they want them to be. And this, of course, is a frightening thought. But they have been, over the last 40 years, purposely targeting the use of education in all fields: social education, economic, cultural, religious, philosophical, literature, biological sciences, etc., to make these ideas persuasive. Now, you might think that all of this is all some kind of science fiction, and I agree that that's how it should be classified, but it is not. This is now considered the serious pursuit of science and is attracting multiplied billions of dollars in research grants and is consuming the agenda of many bioethics and biotechnological university departments of research and learning. Of course, as I said, some good things come out of it, but we must understand the true history of what we're dealing with and realize that while it wears the white coat of science veneer, it is not really true hard science that is promoting this omega point, singularity, human-directed evolution. So where does this leave us? Where does it leave us? Well, we first need to understand where the battle is going to rage. And let me begin by having us listen to an admonishment by the Apostle Paul. Paul said this in Colossians 2:8. Make certain that no one takes you captive by means of hollow, empty, and deceptive philosophies, which are rooted in high-sounding nonsense that comes from mere human thinking and from the spiritual powers of this world rather than on Christ. Now, while the Apostle Paul is specifically proclaiming this admonishment in regard to worldly religious principles and worldly philosophies, many of us do not yet understand how religious what I've been talking about, these ideas and ideologies, actually are. There are people who believe these things, and they believe them firmly, and they are going to pursue them like faith. And it is really, although our faith, Christian faith, is an evidence-based faith, their faith often flies in the face of the evidence and is a kind of leap in the dark. But they are so committed to creating, they wouldn't call it this, but Eden without God, that they are willing to pursue it as a religious fervor. In fact, several scientists say they are shocked at the religious fervor of some of their colleagues because they are pursuing this as if it were a religious faith. I believe that much of what we will be contending with going forward is going to take on a very religious and evil, deceptive spirituality. And so we Christians need to be aware that not all religions meet in churches or synagogues or mosques. Some of them meet in laboratories. Some of them meet in university classrooms. Some of them meet in university think tanks. and they are intent on changing the world into the image of their ideology. Now, so we need to apply this principle, Paul's warning. He says, make certain. What are we to make certain? That no one takes you captive. In other words, you can be taken captive. By what? Means of hollow, empty, and deceptive philosophies. And what does he say these philosophies are rooted in? They're rooted in high-sounding nonsense, is literally what the Greek means, that comes from mere human thinking. And notice this, and from the spiritual powers of this world. This is important to understand. Many of these people think that they're doing this merely as humans and with human intelligence. But Paul is saying that these hollow philosophies that are trying to go against God are actually motivated by and empowered by spiritual forces of evil. And so we need to be aware of this. Now, here's what we're up against. And this is something that all of us must take account of even in our own lives. And that is human enchantment with Pseudo-Eden. Human enchantment with Pseudo-Eden. Now, remember, Pseudo-Eden is a false Eden. It's Eden without God. Pseudo-Eden is like a default setting in the fallen human heart. It is a desire to find Eden, as I said, without God. This is the false Eden that Adam and Eve were sold while they were still in true Eden. So the serpent comes to them and says, look, you're in God's Eden, you're doing what he says, but you know what? You don't need him to have Eden. You can produce your own Eden. You can be your own God. You can separate yourself from him and become your own authority, and you can build Eden on your own. That's what the serpent was selling. Do it yourself. Set up on your own. Don't let God control you. And Satan and his minions are constantly putting in the hearts of simple people the desire for a world of peace where God has been banished. And as an example, for those of you who are old enough to remember this, and even for the younger generation, you probably know this song because it's kind of a retro comeback song in many circles. But you may remember back in 1971, John Lennon penned this famous but truly diluted lyric to the song Imagine. How many of you have ever heard the song Imagine by John Lennon? Yeah, almost everybody. Look at these lyrics and analyze what's being said. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for when? Today. Just live for the moment. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Doesn't it sound beautiful? You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. Marxism, by the way. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Has Marxism turned out that way? No, it created the greatest atrocities the world's ever seen. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. I don't know if you realize it, but you've heard a very poetic and beautifully phrased satanic rant. That's what you just heard. And it's got a very catchy melody. In fact, I remember after hearing it the first time, I had a hard time keeping it out of my head. It'll play over and over and over and over in your head. The devil's a good musician. But notice the content. No heaven, no hell, everyone living only for the present moment. No countries with borders. Sound familiar? Supposedly resulting in nothing to kill or die for, which that isn't true because people will still kill and die for all kinds of things. No religion, and somehow resulting in people living in peace, which we know from many of the experiments in the 20th century simply doesn't happen. The imagine no possessions, Marxism, supposedly resulting in no greed or hunger and a brotherhood of mankind. And of course, when we look at the history of Marxist countries, we see the exact opposite of that. It's a very delusional dream. Then comes the appeal to come and join his dream because he's not the only one dreaming it. And the result, according to John Lennon, will be the world will live as one. And of course, that is the goal of globalism. And if you were to dive in, as I have done, into all of these books on the singularity and the omega point and human-directed evolution and so on, you would discover that these people believe that it will happen when they can get the world to come together as one, and then together we can make this great evolutionary leap into the noosphere. And believe it or not, people believe this very, very strongly. So the question for John would be, John, the world will live as one. One what, John? Well, according to the Bible, one gigantic anti-God and antichrist system that will curse God to the bitter end and result in eternal damnation for millions of souls. That is what the Bible predicts. This enchantment with Pseudo-Eden holds such a sway over the sinful heart and mind that it will cause people to draw astonishing conclusions that are utterly irrational. And we can do this both from according to the past and to the future. Let me give you a biblical example of how we can even take a terrible past and make it seem Edenic. Now, many of you would recall the story in in Exodus that opens with Israel in bondage in Egypt. And we are told that they are in severe agony. They are crying out to God for help. And the book of Exodus opens recording the misery of the Israelites under this ruthless bondage and how they are longing and crying to God for freedom. In fact, Exodus 2:23 through 25 says this: after Moses had tried his thing and left for 40 years into Midian, it says, years passed, and it was actually 40 that passed, and the king of Egypt died, yet the Israelites continued to groan in their slavery. They cried out for help because of their bondage, and God heard their cry for help. So God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked on the Israelites with concern for them and knew it was time to act. So we see this set up in the book of Exodus. Well, we know what happens. God sends Moses. God miraculously sends 10 plagues against the greatest nation and military power on earth and completely devastates it. And the Israelites walk out scot-free. And then when they get to the Red Sea, God literally parts the Red Sea and brings them across on dry lands and destroys the army of Pharaoh who is pursuing them. Then they are brought to Mount Sinai, where God descends literally to the top of the mountain. They not only see the evidence that he is there, but they hear his voice speaking to them and giving them the commandments, and it scares them spitless. And you'll remember that they asked God not to talk to them, but have God talk to Moses, and then Moses translate it to them. They make a vow to worship only him, but after Moses is on the mountain for 40 days, by that time they've already apostatized, made a golden calf, and they're worshiping a false god already. And they've already turned their back on the oath they made as a blood covenant vow. And God is ready to destroy them, but Moses intercedes for them. By the time they've been in the wilderness for a year and they're ready to, and they observe the second Passover. The first one took place in Egypt. They observed the second Passover. And in Numbers chapter 9, they observe this Passover. And then, as recorded in, that's chapter 10, and it's recorded in chapter 11, they begin to complain as God tells them to leave Sinai, break camp, and head toward the promised land. They begin to complain about their hardships. Now you got to understand, these people are living with the visible presence of God's glory in a cloud over the camp, leading them, guiding them. Manna is coming down from that cloud every morning to feed them in this wilderness. They are literally living with God in their midst, and yet these people are complaining. And they begin in the very next chapter to hatch plans and dreams about going back, believe it or not, to Egypt. Now remember, Egypt was the home of their slavery. It was the place they were crying out to God to deliver them from. We know that there were beatings and terrible things going on, because in fact Moses kills an Egyptian because he was beating another Israelite, likely nearly to death, and Moses intervened. So this kind of thing was going on, and they were living in horrible conditions. But all of a sudden, here in the wilderness, where God is asking them to do something, and suddenly their hearts are turning against God, they come under the elusive power of Satan, and they begin to look back a year before and say, you know, Egypt was really pretty nice. Egypt was really pretty good. In fact, I think we'd like to go back to Egypt. In fact, here's what we read when they finally learned that there are giants in the land, and they listened to the 10 spies who brought a bad report and wouldn't listen to Joshua and Caleb, who said, no, we can take the land. God is with us. What was the result? Well, they believed the 10, and they came under, once again, the judgment of God. And here's what they began to do. They cried out and said, why is Yahweh bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? In other words, these giants are going to kill us. Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Now, think about this. You're living with all these miracles. You've seen the Red Sea. You've heard God's voice. He's with you. He's feeding you every day. And you doubt his power to remove a few giants? And somehow, because of their rebellious attitudes, the delusion that they can somehow go back to something that once was monstrously horrible, they now see it as Edenic and desirable. And they actually want to organize, choose a leader, and go back. It's amazing what we can talk ourselves into when we don't want to do the will of God. This is the nostalgic mirage of Pseudo-Eden. And we can do the same thing about the future with a false hope. And we begin to see the future as something that can be created by us without God. So I want to take a few moments this morning and just talk to you very quickly about some of the cultic versions of Pseudo-Eden in the 20th century. And I'll do this pretty quickly as we walk through. The cultic versions of Pseudo-Eden in the 20th century. We've been plagued with many of them. And let me just mention, if we were to take time to do the study, you would learn that the deep roots of all pagan religion was rooted in false messiahs and a way that would ultimately lead to the golden age of a Edenic world. And those got very intertwined with various mythologies, but the whole point of it is they were always looking for the garden of the gods. They were always looking for Eden. However, let me point to the fact that we have had a lot of these even in the 20th century, the past century, and we're probably going to have many more in the present century. How many of you remember that are old enough to remember Jim Jones and the People's Temple? Some of you are, some of you may not. You may have heard about it. There was Jim Jones leading his People's Temple to their, if you remember, ultimately to their utopian jungle paradise, where they were going to create the utopian society, which turned out to be instead a miserable killing field for 918 men, women, and children on November 18, 1978, as Jones ordered all the families to commit mass suicide by drinking a poison Kool-Aid. That's where we get this little thing about people who are Kool-Aid drinkers, which became known as the Jonestown Massacre. Laura Johnson Cole, a survivor of Jonestown, because she had been sent on an errand into town on that particular day, said this: at that point, we thought we were revolutionaries. We thought that if we created this utopian community, people would look to us and appreciate what we were doing and see that it had worked, unquote. Problem is, it didn't work. It turned into a murderous hell. The leader, Jim Jones, was one who twisted the Bible completely to suit his mad schemes to control people, and he mixed in Eastern incarnation teachings and many other bizarre teachings to create the People's Temple's unique brand of doctrine and indoctrination. And so a lot more we could say about that. How many of you remember this cult, Heaven's Gate cult? The Heaven's Gate cult, primarily in California, was led by Marshall Applewhite. And the Heaven's Gate cult kills themselves in San Diego, California in 1997 with the goal of catching up to a UFO they believed was following the comet Hale-Bopp. Now, how many of you would want to catch a UFO following a comet? I can't believe people can believe such nonsense, but the point is they did, and they killed themselves for it. This is what can happen when we fall under the spell of a future Pseudo-Eden and our hearts are not protected from satanic delusion. Or, for example, there's one cult that's very much like it. It's called, often referred to as the OST, but it was the Order of the Solar Temple. It was situated in Europe and some of it here in Canada and France. But the point is that the Order of the Solar Temple, its founder, Joseph de Mambro, said that he would lead humanity to a different and better planet. I don't know if he had ties to NASA or not, but don't think so. But anyway, he was a self-proclaimed reincarnated member of the 14th century Christian order Knights Templar. However, it is said that they discovered he conspired in dozens of murders, including that of a 3-month-old baby he claimed was the Antichrist. Mass murders and mass suicides soon were being perpetrated by this cult. Anticipating what they called an environmental apocalypse, members of the cult began committing ritualistic suicide. In between September 1994 and March 1997, the remains of a total of 74 of the Order of the Knights of the Solar Temple members were found in Switzerland, Canada, and France. And they were all either murdered or had committed suicide. And in some cases, it was hard to know which. Another one. This one sounds really good. The Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, sometimes known as MRTCG. This was in Kanuga, Uganda, and was a fringe Catholic group convinced that the world would come to an end when the millennium calendar turned in 2000. Of course, it didn't come to an end, so the leaders, thinking they're about to lose a lot of their followers, set a new date as March the 17th of 2000, and then they invited all the members to a last celebration before salvation arrived. What actually happened when everyone got together was mass murders and mass suicide. In the end, after all was investigated, after the March 17th massacre in Uganda, they discovered the graves of over 780 people who had been either murdered or had committed suicide. So much for paradise by these means. And I could go on and on. There's been hundreds of these kinds of cults. These are only the most well-known ones. What we often fail to realize is that there have been the same kind of spirit working on national levels. We fail to remember the pseudo-Edenic seeking nation states. And this will be very quick because we don't have to spend too much time with this. We often forget that Nazism and Marxism were both utopian ideologies that were implemented on a nation-state scale. Hitler was going to create the Third Reich, which would be the perfect society, which would get rid of all the undesirables and create a master race of humans that would spread a utopian society throughout the whole world. Of course, they would do this by conquest and force everybody into this utopian society, but that was his dream, that was his ideology. Marxism was propagated on the same thing. We will create an ideal utopian state where no one owns anything and everyone has access to everything. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. It turned out to be something frighteningly different. There were these nation-state ideologies were no less utopian cults than those we've been talking about. The difference is they had the power of the state behind them, and they could do even greater damage than the smaller cults. For example, they all planned to create a brave new perfect society on earth by man-made means. Now, both resulted in the end in mass murder and world-shocking atrocities. Let me give you a couple of brain teasers to think about here. For example, besides the 6 million Jews which Hitler exterminated, he also exterminated, many people don't know this, around 5 million Christians and other dissenters to Nazism. So in all, about 11 million people he exterminated. And we have a very short memory about the much more massive atrocities of the Marxists like Stalin in the USSR and Mao Zedong in China and Pol Pot in Cambodia. In the 20th century, Marxism failed miserably and resulted in totalitarian states that committed the greatest mass murders of innocent people at the hands of tyrants beyond all other centuries combined. They made the 20th century the bloodiest century in recorded history. Now, to get a handle on this, you need to understand that historians estimate on the bottom end that communist totalitarian countries murdered over 100 million people. That's what they can validate. There are some historians who believe that that's only about a third of the actuality because they were very good at, so to speak, burying the evidence. But the point is that there are some who put it as high as 300 million. That seems a little far-fetched, but the point is they know that it's somewhere between 100 million and 300 million people in the Cold War. Now think about, as a way to compare this and how large this is, let's look at the casualties of World War I and World War II. World War I resulted in 10 million military casualties. Now, it is interesting that in World War I, there were civilian casualties, but they were minor. It was mostly combatants. They were minor compared with the combatants. So about 10 million military casualties. However, in World War II, that changed and would escalate this dramatically. There were 50 million to 56 million military and civilian fatalities, with an additional estimated 19 to 28 million deaths from war-related disease and famine. This is, depending on the estimates, between 69 million to 84 million fatalities in just that one war. That's a huge amount of people. That's more than the population of many countries. Between the two wars, then, you have about somewhere between 69 and 84 million people being killed. The Cold War, at its lowest estimate, saw 100 million killed after World War I and World War II. How is it that we lived through the Cold War, and it was one of the bloodiest periods in human history, and most people took no note of it? How is it that the media could ignore such atrocities? And how is it that the very ideology that created them is being taught to our students in universities as something desirable, and our politicians are pushing as something that should be adopted by our nation? This makes no sense. And it's all still going on in North Korea, Vietnam, and isolated areas of China. There are still Marxist communist atrocities taking place. And of course, we still have also the Islamists who are killing Christians and Jews and others who fail to submit in their countries. But let me end by talking about what I believe is the important thing for us to turn our focus to, and that is this: global Pseudo-Eden. The Bible tells us that at the end of this age, there will be an attempt to create a global false Eden, a global false unity. You must remember that Eden is unity, but it was supposed to be unity with God and then unity with each other because of unity with God. But this final global false Eden will try to kick God completely out of the picture and replace him with a false God. And we're going to see that the coming global Pseudo-Eden will have not only the power of the global state behind it, which they are trying hard to create, but the motive and tyranny of a demonic religious fervor driving it. When you combine the power of the state and a religion that is demonic, you have something that can be very, very deadly. Think about Islamic states that are very, very radical. They are driven by a religious fervor. Now, I don't have time to unpack this from Revelation, but I'm going to read one little passage to you. You may recall in Revelation 13, it talks about the Antichrist, the beast, appearing, and how he seems to have had a fatal wound, but that fatal wound is healed, and he comes supposedly back to life. And it says the whole world wonders after him. But then we're told something else, and it's about a religious entity that enters the picture. And I'm going to pick it up there. It says, then I saw another beast. This is after the first beast, coming out of the earth. He had two horns like a lamb. In other words, he looks like a Messiah. He looks like it's a false Jesus. But he spoke with the voice of a dragon. In other words, he's evil. He exercised all the authority of the first beast, which is the Antichrist, on his behalf. He required all the earth and his people to worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. So notice there will be worship, there will be religion, but it will be a false god. He did astonishing miracles as signs, even causing fire to come down from the sky to earth while everyone was watching. Because of these signs he was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. He deceived all the people who belong to this world. He ordered them to set up a great statue in honor of the beast who was fatally wounded and then came back to life. And he was given power to give life and breath to this statue of the first beast so that it could speak. And some scientists who are believers see in this the possibility of biotechnology actually emulating through AI, artificial intelligence, human life, and that it will be so convincing that it will be hard to distinguish. And that is, some say that we're at the very threshold of being able to do this and already are doing it to some degree. Then the statue ordered that anyone who refused to worship it must be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor. And notice this, he is the religious power. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, commonly known as the mark of the beast. And no one could buy or sell anything without that mark, which was either the name of the beast or the number representing his name. This will be global Pseudo-Eden. It will have a powerful and pervasive and coercive religious element in it. And this is what the Bible tells us is coming. And yes, we need to pray that God will hold it back because it can't happen until God allows it to happen. And we need to pray that God would give us more time so we can reach more with the gospel of Jesus Christ. But the point is at some point, God is going to remove his hand. And when he who now hinders no more, then he, Antichrist, is going to rise out of the midst, and he is going to be revealed. And then we will be at the end of the age. And this religious system will begin to coalesce. And it will coalesce around several things. First of all, this global Pseudo-Eden will coalesce first around false unity. It will be a global unity that will be coerced, forced, and everyone will have to be a part of it on penalty of not being able to buy, sell, or whatever. In other words, you will be put to death. You will be persecuted. You will be marginalized if you are not part of it. It will be a forced unity, which is not really unity. And secondly, it will be based on false hope. It will be the hope of a evolutionary leap, a transhumanism that will put us into the golden age where we all become like a god, and we don't need God. In fact, when the founder of the Singularity University was asked several years ago, did he believe that God existed? His answer was, does God exist? Not yet. What do you think he meant by that? He believes that we are in the process through transhumanism of creating God, and that mankind will be God. The old satanic lie is alive and well. Ye shall be as gods. And he was saying, oh, God? No, he doesn't exist yet. We're in the process of producing him. We will be God. And these are some of the most influential people in our world today, driving much of what's going on in our world. Now, let me say this to you. You are the true Eden. They're going to try to counterfeit you. We have true unity with God and true unity with one another through His love. We need to live out that unity, because together we stand, divided we fall. And only those who endure to the end shall be saved, said Jesus. Let me say to you, you and I must stand firm in our faith and love and give the lie to all their elusive misdirection. We have the truth. We have God's love. We have the power of His Spirit. We are the temple of the living God. We are His priesthood. We should stand between God and this dark world and offer anyone who is willing to hear the good news the escape from that darkness and that chaos into the light of God's kingdom. We stand between in order to bring together. That's your job. That's my job. You're not here to pleasure yourself to death. You're not here to entertain yourself to death. There's nothing wrong with entertainment. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But make sure you keep first things first. You're called to be on mission. And we have a great mission. We have a great God who will empower us. This is the day of all or nothing. Half-hearted believers will fall away. Don't you dare be among them. Make up your mind now. As Dr. Phineas S. Brzee used to love to say, nothing to the right, nothing to the left, commitment to Jesus only. Jesus only. I don't care what they offer us if it doesn't include the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and His lordship. It is a false hope. It is a falseness that is a lie. And we need to stand against that. We are the ones standing in the gap, and we must not fail at our task. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for New Hope, and I thank you for its families and its leaders. And while this message has not been a feel-good message, it is a message that I believe they are mature enough to handle and to understand is a message of equipping to enable us to have the right mindset. But we remind ourselves, even in the midst of all this chaos we're dealing with in this world, that you are King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and you are on the throne, and you will rule and reign forever and ever. And we are excited about the day you split the eastern skies, Lord Jesus. And we pray that you will help us to keep our eyes above the horizon. For you said that there is a crown of righteousness awaiting all those who long for your appearing. And we long for your appearing, Lord Jesus. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, just as it is in heaven. That's our cry. And help us, Lord, to be able to lead many to the joy of the kingdom. For in the dark days, even the smallest candle casts quite a light. So help us, Lord, to be a people who keep our light shining brightly. Don't let us hide it in any way, shape, or form. Don't let us live in fear, for we are the people of faith, and our God is greater than all the power of the enemy, and He lives inside of us. In Jesus' name, we give you thanks. And all God's people said, amen.